I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker. Steve Coughlin is an attorney, a decorated intelligence officer, an adjunct professor, and a recognized specialist on Islamic law. He has lectured at the National Defense University, the Army and Navy War Colleges, the State Department, and the FBI. He was purged from the ranks of FBI trainers around 2012 for telling the truth about Islam. He is a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy. He has briefed and advised members of Congress, the Defense Department, national and state law enforcement, and intelligence agencies. Now, he wrote an indispensable book. It's called Catastrophic Failure, Blindfolding America in the Face of Jihad. And I want to show that to you now. It's a terrific book. It's 800 pages of meticulous documentation about how standard Islamic doctrine promotes jihad and Sharia supremacy. It's not an accident. It's not an extremist interpretation. He shows you step by step how it comes right out of the doctrine. He also wrote Bridge Building to Nowhere, the Catholic Church's case study in Interfaith Dialogue, and it's a must read for all non-Muslim faiths. And more of his work, you can see more of his work at Unconstrained Analytics, which you can see from his slides. They all say Unconstrained Analytics, and that's where he's got a lot of his current work. So, Steve, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you, Chris, for having me on. This is a multi-part briefing on Interfaith Dialogue, and the orientation over the next few briefs will be to center on Islam, on main pieces of it. Today, what we're going to do is focus most heavily on the interfaith element as it arises out of Marxism and how it does that. But from time to time, show some slides, show some pieces that keep joining it with Islam, because a key finding that I have, is that there is a united front. That's an actual term of art, united front alliance between the Islamic movement and the Marxist left. And we need to understand it that way. So what I want to do is first look at the political warfare aspects along the Marxist axis today. And one of the things I'm going to defer till one of the later briefs, if we have time, is to bring in the Hegelian part of it pure, because in many respects, in the interfaith domain, some part of the effort is Marxism injecting itself into the interfaith movement. But another key aspect of it is the fact that the interfaith movement is actually a cover for a theosophical worldview that has its own orientation that dovetails nicely with Marxism. That would be its own brief, and if it sounds convoluted, it kind of is, but that's not my fault. So what we'll do is we'll start going down the line. I want to give a couple lead-ins to the main topic. One of them is, I love to always start with a couple slides, and one of them is, it's the Platonic nightmare. And what I'm going to do is show you how these concepts here act in real ways, directly inject into subversion campaigns that were made famous by many, including Bezmenov. So here, I'm not going to read all these slides. We're going to hit some slides with a lot of words in them. You guys will have copies of the slides. A couple here and early on we're going to hit, but down the range, all I'm going to do is hit the key points on them, and you can then get the whole, you could go and spend time to read where I got them and how they say it. But here we go. It is entirely possible that the true and authentic reality is being drowned out in propaganda fashion. The place of authentic reality is taken over by fictitious reality. My perception is indeed still directed toward an object, but now it is pseudo-reality, deceptively appearing as being real, so much so that it becomes impossible anymore to discern the truth. And that gives way to the slide I call the Platonic nightmare, that I think drives almost all the stuff I do on a certain level. The sophists, Plato say, fabricate a fictitious reality, that the existential realm of man could be taken over by pseudo-realities whose fictitious nature threatens to become indiscernible as truly a depressing manner. And yet, this Platonic nightmare I hold possesses an alarming contemporary relevance. For the general public is being reduced to a state where people are not only unable to find out about the truth, but also become able to search for the truth because they are satisfied with deception and trickery and have determined their convictions. So that's a philosophical way of saying something. And of course, we're all saying Plato sit on a rock, but here you have Bezmenov and deception was my job. And what did he say? As I mentioned before, exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who is demoralized is unable to assess true information. Even if I show him with information with authentic proof, he will refuse to believe it. And of course, if we start from here, the first stage of subversion. It is the process which is basically demoralization. It says it for what it is. So the moment you bring a country to the point of total demoralization, when nothing works anymore, when you are not sure what's right or wrong, good or bad, where there is no division between good and evil, when even leaders of churches say something, and it moves on. So what am I saying here? What I'm saying here is that theoretical concept from Plato, which was actually taken from the fall of Athens and its war with Sparta, is something that is consciously copied by those people who engage in political warfare and subversion campaigns, and it's at the core of it. And I think it's very helpful to get an understanding of it up front. So here is the classic slide on Marxism, on political warfare, because we're talking about political warfare. And what does it say? Whether it is the intrusion of hackers, a major explosion in the World Trade Center, or a bombing attack by bin Laden. By the way, this was written 2 years before 9/11. So this is not, so all these things actually happened. All of these greatly exceed the frequency bandwidth understood by the American military. This is because they have never been taken into consideration and have even refused to consider means that are contrary to tradition and to select measures of operation other than military means. What are they saying? We're going to engage in a form of warfare the Americans have no ability to understand, and they will not figure it out. And I think 20 years later, 24, 25 years later, I'm just trying to point out to people they were over the target not then, and they're still over the target now. So let's take a look at what Lenin says, which is what I think political warfare is based on. Okay, the frequency bandwidth that the Americans will never get to wrap their minds around is the dialectic. But I'll take this right out of Lenin's book. Dialectics is the theory of knowledge of Hegel and Marxism. This is their emphasis. This is the aspect of the matter. It is not an aspect of the matter, but the essence of the matter. So what am I saying? Everything you know about Marxism, sans the dialectic, means you could be very smart about how you're going to lose the war. I'm going to argue if you knew about the dialectic sticking strictly with Plato and Hegel, you could work your way to an answer and defeat Marxism because you know their attack mechanism. So here we have, Lenin goes on, if you're someone who thinks dialectically, human knowledge is not and does not follow a straight line, but a curve which endlessly approximates a series of circles in a spiral. So political warfare, it's dialectical. What I put together to get this concept out are a couple visualizations, and one of them is the dialectical airplane. What I like to show here is here's this plane flying over the top, and it drops these bombs, okay? And as it hits the surface, it causes an explosion. And if you're in the blast zone, everything you're responding only to the blast zone. So this is one that goes through history, from esotericism, the French Revolution, to current hate speech narratives. And some people like to call it the MiG-19, the dialectical airplane, because it's high quantity, low quality, mass produced, and it's ineffective if people actually challenge it. But let me take that dialectical airplane and bring it current. And what I want to show is when the impeachment happened to Trump back in January, they knew at that point that Republicans would allow a impeachment of the president based on star chamber tactics. So the second they realized that, the second that bomb hit the ground down below, if you look straight up, the COVID lockdown happened. And as soon as the COVID lockdown happened and it was secure, look up, they launched the Antifa BLM. And as soon as that started playing out, watch the blast zone, look up, you see they launched the Ukrainian event. And if you go to the blast zone, what happens is you're responding only to what's going into that blast zone. And now in that blast zone, the positive narrative and the negative narrative is already in there, so that your actual verbal responses are already set for you. It's scripted. And what you'll find is when people say, hey, we got to understand a bigger picture of this, the 100% reaction is we don't have time to know what's going on in the big picture because we need to fight this battle. And so what you could see is you see these little bomb blasts go up is all they have to do is look up and shoot down the plane. But what they're doing is going from fighting one battle that they're already taking loss to the next until they hit the cliff and they go over the cliff. And so that's kind of a nice way to talk about dialectical negation. So the leading indicator that a major operation was going to start was the launch of the impeachment. The trailing indicator is you waited for it to happen. But if you wait for every bomb to hit the ground, all you're doing is responding to events in the ground in the moment, and you're never able to take a larger picture. So a key part of this dialectical airplane is to get people to understand the metaphor involved in it. And that metaphor involved in it is that we're trapped in narratives that keep maneuvering us wherever they want to take us. So that dialectical airplane really is the idea that there are something called lines of effort, and each line of effort has multiple lines of operation, and each line of operation has multiple lines of action. So here's an example, just to kind of, before we go into the full understanding of interfaith, one that doesn't relate to that so people can understand it. Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution, the United States shall guarantee to every state in the Union a republican form of government, and it shall protect them, each of them, against invasion and against domestic violence. Well, guess what? We saw a dialectical attack, and when they went after the Constitution, there was one just for Article 4, Section 4. So every time you hear someone say today democracy, they are not saying republic. And it's never been the case that the United States has been a democracy, never. And if you take it all the way back to the beginning of the term, democracies have always been perverted or malformed republics. The term border is used to talk about invasion, and peaceful protest covers for violence. So each element of the Constitution has been taken. So let's take a look at that bomb blast. We're going to go through here quickly because this is just to kind of create the visualization. Inside that bomb blast, there's a central blast, and there's two elements rotating counterclockwise counter to each other, a positive and a negative charge. And you could just say that those positive and negative charges are circling around each other, and what they're circling around in this dialectical attack is a common narrative. So you could say that positive charge is Fox News because they tell you what you want to hear, and the negative charge say we want to hear MSNBC, but at all times they're always taking the position vis-a-vis an already determined narrative that's set. And what that does is it contains and creates a containment. You could think of that as the positive is thesis and the antithesis is the other. So, and you know, as the cycling continues, it just takes on more of a purple look because, of course, blue and red are that color, creating containment field. But here's the problem. The targeted demographic, including the opposition, is contained. And an opposition is contained as a controlled opposition. We're not going to go into this part of this. We're going to go far enough to hold things up later. But of course, the narrative you hear inside that circle is the one you want to hear. So if you're kind of conservative or you're kind of a populist American, you want to listen to what Fox News, and you're oriented against MSNBC, for example. But actually, you're both trapped. This would be the same as in the Matrix as the blue pill players. So this is how you trap people in those narratives. So if you're contained in the circle, you're in the churn and you're being churned. So you could fight or fight back. You're always in mad pursuit of the corner in the round room. Okay. So we have kind of developed, we're at Unconstrained, we're developing a phrase that a certain guy, a rabbi on this call, kind of tipped us off to, and we're using it a lot. We're going to start making a demand on people to stop seeing what they know. That's living inside that circle, and start knowing what you see. I suppress some of these slides because we don't have time to go into all of them, but if we have time at the end, we can go look at it. So political warfare is Marxism. It's the Maoist insurgency model. So let's take some quotes from Lenin. And this is going to be one of those things where I'm going to hit these points and you can read the whole points later. Marxism is always, and Leninism is always capable of moderating their view on religion when they have to. And their position on destroying religion is never going to get in the way of the actual mission of winning the revolution. But it is always relentlessly hostile to the religion because it's dialectical in its orientation. So Marxism must combat religion using the dialectical approach. But direct attacks on religion should never interfere with the operation. When you're in the position where you're striking in the movement, you don't ask yourself whether you should go after those Christians or Orthodox priests in his time who were joining the revolution. What was his answer? We're going to come up with it. Of course you let them join. We'll sort that out later. So atheist propaganda means you never, a key element of Marxism is it's operational in its intent, or it's praxis oriented. So you have these quotes from Mao, who threatened to line his ideologues up against the wall if they suspended movement and revolution to be able to go after people they don't like ideologically. You don't stop the battle for that. You win the battle. So again, I just kind of want to sort through here so we understand Marxism is orientation to religion, and it's 100% hostile all the time, every time. So it is the enemy of religion. It has a struggle against religion. So here's where he's being asked if he can have clergy join the organization, and he says, of course, and don't stop them. Why would you do that? Why would you do that? They're confusing people. So these are the quotes I'm just lining up here so people can get a sense on how black and white Marxism sees this. And of course, I like to use this one because after the revolutionary fighting is back, he just basically said, line them up and shoot them. It needed to get done with the priests and religion as soon as possible. Arrest the priests as enemies of the revolution and saboteurs and execute them without mercy. Excuse me. So this is the position of the left. Political warfare, penetration of religion has always been a main line of effort, always. So let's take a look at Gramsci. We have the stylized quote in the bottom, but this is what he really said actually reveals more. And it's socialism is precisely the religion. Marxists at the very top understand there is a theological, or I'll say theosophical orientation to Marxism, and they lean on it because it's what creates that religious fervor within it. Socialism is precisely the religion that must kill Christianity. It is a religion in the sense that it too is a faith. And because it has substituted for the consciousness of the transcendental God of the Catholics, trust in man and his best strengths as the sole spiritual reality. Now, I want to make a point here, and it's the one that would go with the esoteric nature of interfaith alongside its hostile left-wing orientation. And that is Judaism and Christianity, and even to a degree Islam, are transcendent in their orientation. And it's what separates them out from other religions in a very real way. Most religions in the world and all the esoteric religions that copy Christianity or Judaism, okay, they're called immanent religions, that God exists in nature and God needs man to pick up the pieces of God and nature and figure out who God is so God can know himself. And therefore, God knows himself most perfectly at the end of history. Just like all dialectical movements operate to the end of history when, as Hegel put it, God is reformed as absolute act. So my point here is he even understands in this point that the whole concept of transcendence is a major obstacle to Marxism. And here we have Bella Dodd, who pointed out in 1953 that in the 1930s she had the role of putting over 1,100 priests into Catholic seminaries, and she said it was utterly fantastic. It was greatly successful. And here you have Manning Johnson. He also testified in the 1953 House Un-American Activities Committee that in 1935, the Comintern, the Communist International, dedicated to United Front strategy, calling for the penetration and subversion of cultural and civil and religious organizations in furtherance of seizing power. And of course, in 1940, Saul Alinsky founded the Industrial Areas Foundation, which from its founding to this day, the IAF is still the most powerful interfaith organization in the country. And I think it's very important to keep that in mind. So in the 1935, when the Comintern stood these organizations up, they created an organization, I think it was 1934, and the next year was 1935, year either way on that. But in Germany, they created an organization called Antifa. And the next year, they created a sister organization in the United States called the American League Against War and Fascism. So the Antifa in America takes its roots back to this. And it was run by a man named Reverend Ward. And what you see here is that what Manning Johnson, when he testified, he left communism and forswore it, is how they deeply penetrated the churches and how easy it was. There are quite a few of them who were duped. Some were duped, and some were loyalists. And we're just following this track here to show that what we're seeing today has some of its main origins in the 1930s. And of course, for it to be functional in the 1930s, when the Comintern decided to turn to America, they had to have a homegrown list of people all ready to go. And of course, you know, social justice Jesus was in formation in the 1950s. And I think in the Jewish community, and please correct me if I pronounce this wrong, Takamalum is the equivalent there. And in both instances, they have a way of turning things upside down. So if you read this, and what you're seeing right there, that comes right out of a Marxist publication in the 1950s. This is how Marxists want you to understand this. And if that is what you're hearing in your church, you better recognize what you see. And then of course, they appropriate all the nice words. I just quote Bella Dodd from the 1950s. They will take some of these Christian terms and they'll redefine them. I think a major problem we have is I would think that maybe as many as 40 to 50% of people who believe they're serious Christians don't understand that's Marxism. And there is an antecedent to that. And here's just her quoting Trachtenberg, where they basically said, what we're going to do is we're going to oppose Marxism. We're just not going to call it that. And Americans will adopt it. And that follows the strategy from this esoteric worldview that if we circle around one day, we'll get to. And of course, the archetype for critical race theory comes from, in Bella Dodd's book written in 1950s, almost everything you see in Black Lives Matter critical race theory narrative can be sourced to the stuff that was put out in the 30s by Stalin. As long ago as the 1940s, the party was planning cynically to use the Negroes as instruments of the revolution to come in the United States. The theory contrived by Stalin, unleashed by Foster, was to encourage self-determination, ... But this was a very serious effort. And so political warfare, again, is Marxism. Let's talk about Marxism from Lenin. Well, let's talk about rainbows. My question is, could the penetration of churches look like this? I think I got a good representation of a lot of these religions, right? Can it look like that? And the question becomes, going back to that thesis, antithesis, is to understand that this form of Marxism actually comes from, this form of Christianity comes from a form of Marxism that's the antithesis, is to point out that a church that flies that flag is negating itself in the process. And that's the point you really have to understand. And by the way, a good percentage of you may respond, I know the minister who does that. He just doesn't know what he's doing. I think that Marxism in this political warfare interfaith regime wants people to never know they were turned upside down. That is how they want it to go. So here we have one of the flags that emerged this year, big time, non-binary trans. But what that has become is the intersectional rainbow. And the intersectional rainbow today is the equivalent of the red flag. And they say so. So where you see that flag, and here's an explanation for what all the colors mean, because this flag came out this year. I think, with the triangles, one on the side, that is the intersectional rainbow. I think, let me see something here. Nope. So you see groups all over the country, Marxists orienting on this. We have no compassion and we ask for none. These people, if they get power, are going to kill people. So here's a little quick thing on what intersectionality is. And what I want to point out is intersectionality is a term in Marxism that was generated to explain what they've been doing by other means later. It is the dialectical process of picking an issue and creating its antithesis. And you see that cancel culture right there. When every line of effort and an intersectional line of operation is hit and destroyed, the culture is canceled. I'm going to take a bigger picture of that, and what you're seeing is I broke up the original intersectional wheel, and you could see right here, old is ageism, and it attacks the young. The non-literate is educationalism and attacks the credentialed. Persons with disabilities is ableism, and it attacks able-bodied. Every positive character at the top has its negative, and the negative attacks it. And if every one of them is attacked, well, then you've destroyed the entire identity of the population. Now, the Frankfurt School term for this was created by a man named Lukács, a Hungarian with broken German, and it was Aufheben der Kultur. And what intersectionality is the mechanism of how Aufheben. Okay, now Aufheben der Kultur, translated loosely into English, is destroy the culture, or, as you see it on the street, cancel culture. So what you're seeing here is you cannot possibly, we could put in the upper realm Christianity, and at the bottom end of that circle, atheism. And of course, you are woke when you've canceled it all out. Now, bringing some of the Islamic components in here, we have a leader of the Islamic movement, Bazian, saying here that in terms of being aligned with the left, the Islamic movement in America is all into adopting the Marxist intersectional lines of attack. We have a couple quotes on there. I thought I would just use a couple just to demonstrate it. So, as part of the Islamic movement being completely interoperable with the far left in a political warfare regime, Islamophobia is to the Islamic movement what hate speech is to the left, and abrogation is what it is to the Islamic movement as dialectical negation is to the left. And I think one of the things I really want to emphasize is we really need to understand this. And here's just another example of the Islamic movement talking about intersectionality. So their attack in the West is that, and there's a narrative they're using. So it's really not important for us to read all these quotes, because I just want to point out, we talk about mass line attacks and people say, well, Steve, I thought you were talking about Marxism. Why do you keep bringing up mass line? What does that got to do with Marxism? And so what we basically say is, well, that happens to be chapter 11 of Mao's little red book, The Mass Line. And of course, when you awaken the people, aren't they woke? Aren't they woke? Aren't they woke? And so as we look at this flag, we see this quote, what's going to be required of us to address so much of the right's regression, so much of the rollback of the progress that we've all enjoyed. Is this basically the governor of California making the allusion to repressive tolerance? And here what we have is a quote from Marcuse in 1965 in a big article he wrote called Repressive Tolerance. And if you read it, and I'll read it, but I'm not going to go into Mao, because Mao is just a very militant way of saying the same thing. But here's how I want you to listen, because it's facially neutral. You could hear it and just move on to the next point. You actually have to think about what he just said. This means that the way should not be blocked on which a subversive majority could be developed, because they're a subversive minority at the time. And if they are blocked, the reopening may require apparently undemocratic means. They would include the withdrawal of toleration of speech and assembly from groups and movements. Liberating tolerance then would mean intolerance against movements from the right and toleration of movements from the left. Well, you know, after Mao ran his revolution, it was the running dogs of American imperialism. democracy for the people and dictatorship over the reactionaries. The state apparatus is the instrument by which one class oppresses the other. We definitely do not apply a policy of benevolence to the reactionaries. Our policy of benevolence is applied only within the ranks of the people, not beyond them to the reactionaries. So you see that the enemy is dehumanized and they don't deserve to respect you. And this carries forward. And I think you need, when you see your minister, priest, or rabbi with that intersectional rainbow, he is one of the people who will be one of your, I'm trying to think of the book from Dostoevsky, Grand Inquisitor. Okay, so what I'm saying here is they are actually saying the same thing. So let's bring this political warfare concept current. Okay, we're going to go through a few things so I could put the foundation here. So when we finish this off and talk about the Islamic movement, we'll be ready for next week to be able to talk about the Islamic part of it, having built this foundation. From Rudy Duchka in 1969, I guess, I thought it was 68. He was a Gramsci Marxist, and he was the person who adopted the phrase "the long march to the institution." Our historically correct limitation of our action to the university should not be made a fetish. So when he said long march to the institution, of course, he's basically noticing that Mao perfected the long march. So the Gramsci term long march for the institutions is they're saying they're adopting the Maoist model. So Marcuse in America, he moved from New York, moved from Frankfurt, to extend the base of the student movement. Rudy Duchka proposed the long march to the institutions. So here we have, remember we brought up Alinsky talking about the founding IAF, and what is he saying? Because we're not going into the mass line as a definition. When he says first we must rub raw the resentments of the people in the community, it means the mass line is taking all their grievances and echoing them back to them, not for the purpose of ever solving the problem, but for rubbing raw their hostilities. And of course, Saul Alinsky's main point of access was through IAF into the interfaith movement. So this was a penetration into interfaith. And as I already briefed earlier, I want to emphasize it, and it was brought up this morning in a different meeting when someone thought I missed this, but is penetrating religions has always been a main line of attack, always. In fact, it's a main line of operation with many supporting attacks. And each attack is styled to each religious organization. So here it is talking about how he deals with priests, ministers, and rabbis, and how he appeals not to their sense of faith, but to their sense of materialist needs and wants. And here we have another picture of Gramsci. And when Gramsci was brought to America by Saul Alinsky, he was given cover in the Industrial Areas Foundation through the Archdiocese of Chicago, still one of the most radical dioceses in the world. And when it got too hot, his partner in crime, Monsignor John Egan, went to Notre Dame, and the official biographer and notekeeper of Gramsci Marxism ended up being Bourdieu, and his son is Bourdieu. So what I'm trying to show is these lines of attack to religion are unrecognized. And I would like to point out something. I'm Catholic. I would have no problem going after these people in the Archdiocese of Chicago for this type of subversion, because it is subversion. But because these religious penetrations into institutions, including the universities, are left unaddressed, they're unopposed. So we put this together to kind of show how it works for critical philosophy that becomes Marxist critical theory, that breaks down into intersectionality, that is turned into a mass line movement by Black Lives Matter, that when it powers down into a public, intimidates the individual, it silenced the Republicans, and it neutralized the FBI. So we got a few more here on just this basic concept, and we're going to transition to how we're seeing it today, the interfaith alliance between Islam and the far left, which is a very potent line of attack. Going back to Marcuse, the dominion of this democracy is not republic, still leaves room for building of autonomous local bases. The increasing technological scientific requirements for production and control make the universities into such a base. They need to create counter cadres to, of course, create counter institutions, and that term is counter state operations. This base extends from the campuses to the economic and political institutions where educated labor is needed, new scientific revolutions, the long march. So what are they saying in 1972? They're going to take control of the seminary, they're going to take control of the university, and they're going to be very laid back until they get to leadership positions and take over institutions. And now we're 50 years into it, and all of a sudden we're seeing attacks on free speech in the form of, well, because you don't have authority for your view, we shouldn't have to listen to it. Oh, by the way, Marxism is scientific socialism, so our view is scientifically correct because we said so, and because we'll beat you up if you don't agree or kill you. And because most of the people who will disagree with us in this worldview are over 50 years old and dying out, 100% of the experts will be us, and therefore why should we respect the First Amendment when the First Amendment doesn't recognize that only people with authority to speak should be able to speak? I think some of us see that right now. So political warfare in the current context, the Islamic movement joins the effort. Of course, in 2016, Rich Higgins and I wrote this white paper on the defeating the Islamic movement inside the United States, where we made the very hard argument that there is a united front alliance between Islam and the Marxist left. We documented in 2015, right there, that we need to make a conscious admission about Black Lives Matter. This is when the alliance was created, 5 years before 2020. And here's where they were talking about in 2016, how the people want to topple the regime. And where I got this from is in a brief where it's people need to be afraid of themselves, which is, of course, what Marx said. One of the books we focus on is Interfaith Dialogue, a guide for Muslims, was put out by the IIIT. That's a Muslim Brotherhood entity. And for the product we're putting together on not just interfaith, but subversion, is dialogues are dialectical events spread through periods of practice designed to destroy the objects of what they do. So when you hear someone say a dialogue, you're thinking we're having a conversation, because it's a synonym with that. But ultimately its actual meaning and purest meaning is a dialogue is a dialectical event that seeks to destroy what's being discussed. So just don't get all up your shorts in a bunch every time you hear dialogue, because sometimes people just mean that. But if it means coming to the table to give something up, you need to think about it. So here we go to the section in the Islamic IIIT's Interfaith Dialogue, where it lays out some of the demands of how to do interfaith dialogue. And I want you to think about what you're listening to. They took it right from BeliefNet, from a guy named Lewart Swindler and Richard Landau. He said, dialogue must take place in an atmosphere of mutual trust. Fair enough. Okay. Each dialogue partner has the right to define his or her own religious belief, so that the rest can only describe what it looks like to them from the outside. So what does this say? It says you're only allowed to talk about my religion in terms that I'm willing to accept, even if in your religion, and we're not talking about people being anti this or anti that. We're talking about someone who has a faith, and that faith puts them in opposition to that view. And the rule is that you're not allowed to oppose it. Therefore, you are being put in submission to that discussion, right? A Jew doesn't have to agree with a Christian, and a Christian doesn't have to agree with a Jew. We're not talking about this in anti-Christian rhetoric or anti-Semitic rhetoric. We're talking about the fact that a true belief in the one means that there is an actual a decision not to agree with the other. But to tell the person in the interfaith movement this is the demand to suppress his view. So moving on to the next point, participants entering the dialogue must be willing to reflect upon themselves and their own religion, meaning we're going to have you reflect on what we think about your religion, because although you're not allowed to talk about what we said, we're allowed to talk about what you said. So I want to point out really quick here, this Interfaith Dialogue by the IIIT, this book, they're leveraging the interfaith movement, which I'm trying to create the case in short time here, was already something that is heavily influenced by Marxism. And so each one of these things has a cost. Let's go to the next point. Practice fairness when speaking for or about other faiths, and speak in a way that people of that religion can affirm as accurate. Well, that means you're not allowed to say, I'm really concerned that your Quran says you must slay them where you find them. And if he says that that's really not what it means, and you just saw some people get killed, you're not allowed to disagree. That is submission. And again, this is the rule. The rules the Islamic movement are using come from belief nets, Leonard Swindler and Richard Landau. Avoid misusing scripture, by which he means that no one shall attempt to use one's own religion to dismiss another religion as invalid. Look, nobody's getting into invalidating other religions. But if somebody is scriptural, worldview, their faith is based on revelation, okay, and they believe that that revelation forms their opinion, they're supposed to engage in this discussion in a way that they are systematically shut down from being able to do so. Of course, I think we all understand abusive activity in that area, but if you can't express your faith in the interfaith movement, maybe the intent is that you're now supposed to give, you are already in a state of submission. So here you have, don't these conditions render the faithful defenseless? And has the faith just been subordinated to a higher authority? And is not that the intent of the interfaith movement? The price of interfaith dialogue under these circumstances is the calculated destruction of faith. So here, one of the people I work with, Yaakov, put out something called Domestic Terror 2.0 in January 2020. And he basically pointed out that the ground game, that the domestic terror that we saw coming that year was going to have a lot of Islamic influence, even if it was being done by the left. And sure enough, here you have Linda Sarsour, a major leader in the Islamic movement, running the ground game for some of those protests in 2020. They are interactive and interoperational completely. One of the big reasons you're seeing some very real hostility inside the Islamic movement today is because the alliance between the hard left and the Islamic movement is fracturing over the October 7th, how the October 7th is playing out. And of course, you know, I put out before Floyd, the date on that is after, because it was being held private, that everything we saw setting up was going to start in Minnesota. And it started, you know, I stated why it was going to start in Minnesota. So you have Yaakov Applebaum putting out something called Terrorism 2.0 in January. We put this out. I put something out called Warning on Racism a year before the election, saying how the election was going to be run would happen that way. And so the question is there any evidence in this interfaith alliance that we're seeing some things? And what I'd like you to do is take a look at these things we're seeing on Twitter, hundreds of them a day. The Answer Coalition, of course, is far left. And I saw, and coexist, I saw that at the beginning of the briefing. Coexist is one of those phrases that I think was coined by Answer and adopted by the Muslim Student Association 20, 30 years ago. And of course, coexist really means we have the right to live in your country following our laws, and you must coexist with us. We don't have to become Americans. And that worked not only for immigrant Muslims, but for immigrants, period. And the whole goal with refugee status is destroy national identity. So what you see here is, you know, what you're seeing with this United Front is the Palestinian stuff Islamic, or is it Marxist? And what you're seeing here, and I could play this out, is was the October 7th, and clearly it was Hamas directed attack into residential Israelis and massacred them. So I'm not trying to push away from that extreme culpability. I think that violence so undid activities. It's caused things to fail. I mean, right now you have both the New York City and the Los Angeles police arresting these protesters now, and that gives you a signal that these people are playing out the card. But why do I have this here? Because there's, you know, you saw all these protests this week. You know, some of the people who will get most of the coverage will be people who are just tired of the war, but clearly this is an extension of the color revolution that was started last summer to oust Bibi, and we can, you know, shore up that argument. So here you see all these churches burning last Easter, this Easter, or Bibles being burned, I think in Kentucky or Tennessee. And here you have a man being arrested for the burning down of, who's being detained in France for the burning of Notre Dame. So what I'd like to ask is, are there any questions at this time? Because I think the goal of this brief was to set up how the interfaith movement is an extension, mainly in this brief, of Marxism, but there's also this esoteric stuff that informs that very heavily, and see where we're at with that. I wanted to give people a flavor for the interfaith activity as quickly as I could. I mean, there are pieces that we just don't have time to discuss, but there are things going on with it. And to understand the play, what you have with the Islamic movement is they saw in the 1980s that it was successful. And so they saw racism, sexism, homophobia, and they just tacked the word Islamophobia after it. And for quite a while, the far left did their heavy lifting. So with that, I mean, if there are any questions, let me know.
Steve, we keep faith with the audience. We promised them a 1-hour webinar, and we're going to stick to that. So there's only one question. It's in the chat. If you want to take that one up, we can do that, or we can hold it until next time. What would you like to do?
I can look at it. Let's see. For Steve, at one point in the dialectic timeline, the Marxists had enough power to murder people. What are the remaining steps that the Marxists have between now and they get away with the mass murder, and how long will it be if we don't stop them? That's an interesting question, and I'll tell you, one way of looking at that, because I'm going to give you a pro and a con on that, is I believe that they staged a revolution and they can't get lift. And they can't, so winning a revolution is one thing, sustaining a revolution or institutionalizing is another. And so my fear, my sense is, or the positive side of me says, it seems to me that they can't get traction. And I think you're seeing a generational thing where the older people who created this are aging out, and the younger people don't have the intellectual capability. Now, the pessimistic side says, well, they haven't brought the hammer down yet, and they're looking to do that. And, you know, if you remember that the revolution was 1917, and a lot of the Red Terror didn't really start till like 1921 or something like that in large numbers, that they might not be off schedule. But I think that they're not consolidating things the way they wanted to. And I do believe that their popularity and to the extent that they had critical mass, I think that they're losing it. And I think that the activity in the streets right now with the Palestinian movement is accelerating that. I saw a poll that said that somewhere over 70% of Americans under 30 agreed with the Israeli position. You certainly wouldn't know that to watch the news. So my answer is twofold, and we have to watch it, because if their situation is eroding, and I think it is, regardless of the answer, I think that they will become desperate to do something. So I think that that's something to watch for. I think one of the things I wanted to point out was, and I left out, and if there's time left over at the end of the series, I'll pick it up again, because it actually is important, is the theological underpinnings of the interfaith movement independent of Marxism. And that entity's ability to emulate the religions they copy. Okay, so I'll give you an example coming from Hegel. Hegel didn't learn what he learned at the university. He learned it in a pietist Lutheran seminary in Tübingen, Germany. And it turns out that the Germans were well aware that certain seminaries in Germany were actually covert Hermetic centers. Okay, we'll leave that to a point. But one of the ideas he had was in this worldview had it that God existed as absolute act, I mean undifferentiated act, that who couldn't know himself. So he pours himself out into nature, and in nature, the superabundance of God has him just spill all over the place. So he needs man to go around, pick up the individual pieces and find little pieces of God. And over time, those pieces get put together. And as they get put together, God, undifferentiated act, knows himself more. And then at the end of it all, God is completely reformed. Hegel called that absolute act. but you can explain it as the Prisca Theologia. That's, if we want to go to a completely non-Hegelian nature of it. And the Prisca Theologia was the complete religion at the beginning of time that broke into pieces and is now reforming as a religion. So this religion over here had these pieces that were correct, but the correct parts were mixed with some of the detritus of the stuff that wasn't correct. And this religion over here had pieces that were correct. But what happens is all the incorrectness of other religions burn off and they come together. They become part of the new religion. And that's what the interfaith movement is covering for, this reforming. Now, it follows that means from the many, you have one. And that's why there's a huge orientation to socialism or communalism because of that. And it's why they align with each other. But the other part of it is, if you go back to what Hegel did, God is undifferentiated act is God the Father. God poured out into nature is the Son, and the Spirit, the Geist, is what moves history forward to that endpoint. So it becomes very clear that what you believe today is always truer than what you believe yesterday. And it's also true that these religions should all put all their differences aside so they can form. And the key element of that reformed religion is it's also one that's controlled by the state. We could put that many other ways, and it's maybe a more refined way of putting that. So that is what Marxism is grafting onto when it does that. And I'm cutting a whole lot of things out of this discussion to get to this point. But so I think when you look at the interfaith movement, it is a hostile theosophical worldview that exists to destroy. This whole thing reaches back to the original concept of the dialectic. We're not going to go into that now, but the original concept of the dialectic which uses the original use of the word science, which in Greek was episteme, that became scientia in Latin, and it became science today. And that science was to remove everything you know from this world so you could know the real, and the real was not your world. So I think the interfaith, when you go to a church or a synagogue, you're running into people who are trying to impose a hostile competing theology that, to the extent they're able to get away with it, they make it look like what you're supposed to believe. And they take a little piece here, they take a little piece there, and they give themselves 50 years to do it. And the whole goal is to have you come out of that whole process not even knowing that your theological worldview has just been turned upside down. Well, Marxists just want to destroy it. So they're okay with that. And their whole orientation to the world exists as if that were true. And they just created scientific socialism that adopted everything and then functionally does the same thing. So I believe that anything that's interfaith is wrong. It's always an attack on the entity that allows it. I suspect that back in the day, in the larger churches, you had some good ministers, priests, and maybe rabbis, but who were good enough not to get fired. It's like the military. Good officers in command are looking to their next command. There's 2/3 of them are not even in consideration for the next command, but they got to give them a job somewhere, and they just say, let's take these guys. He's a good guy. Okay, he's a good guy. We'll put him in the interfaith world. But what happens is, over a period of decades and maybe a century, these people start to pull on the main religion. And I think that analogy I'm making, even if that's not specifically accurate, would still be true, that over a period of time, it's going to accrete some authority. And I think that's what we're looking at. But right now, I think that worldview is the dominant organizational view.
Thank you, Sharon. Steve, you get the last word, then we'll close the meeting.
I'll say I remember seeing a video of how they would go to. It was in a Presbyterian church. My impression is that it's an operation. They do it the same in all the churches, where people would sit at tables, and then they would have a certain way of focusing on isolating individuals and then corner them into narratives. I just think that if you want to say that there's a benefit to various churches and synagogues working together for the common good of a community, I don't think anybody disagrees with that. I think interfaith is something that has this particular view to that. Next week, what we're going to do is go into some of the interfaith as it impacts and how it is an attack on identity, and how it works itself out in theology.
Thanks everybody for being here, and we'll see you again next week. Bye now.